It's good to go.
All right, welcome everyone. Happy Friday. Thanks for joining our Tech Talk today. We have Dr. Brent Wilson back for another talk on cybersecurity. He's a professor of computer science and cybersecurity at George Fox University, and they're going to talk about cryptography today. So thank you for being here, and take it away.
Well, thank you for having me back. I definitely enjoy spending a little bit of time with you folks. For those that are with me here today and those that are watching recorded, it's a beautiful Friday afternoon, and glad to be a part of this today. So what my goal is today is really to give you sort of a high-level overview of cryptography. What is it? How is it used? Why is it important? And we're going to spend a little bit of time in sort of the theory, some of the history, because I think it's really important to understand what has got us to the point where we're at. And then we're going to actually dive in and do some encryption and decryption. And we'll use some tools so that we don't have to work too hard today. I did put a little subtext in there that it's going to get a little mathy today, but we're going to keep it as high level as we can. Don't worry about it too much. If if getting mathy scares you, you're fine. I'll do it. You just watch, and we'll be just fine. So so a question. And I guess I'm going to ask questions, but it's really going to be more rhetorical. You can think about it to yourself, I suppose. Question to Tech Academy. Chat. Is there like a chat discussion? Oh, there it is.
Yes. So there are some people already talking in the chat.
Okay. Does that change the presentation in any way? Are we still good to go?
It still looks great.
Okay.
Yep, looks good.
All right. So anyway, so as we go, if I ask questions and you want to participate, please go ahead and just type in any particular answers you may think about. And then at the end, our hosts will open up our mics and we can have some dialogue and discussions, and that would be great. So the first thing is what I want to share with you is just let's start with the foundation of information security, the concept of what we call our CIA triad. Now, CIA not as in Central Intelligence Agency, and I apologize, phone hasn't rang all day long till just now. We're going to let that just go. And hey, can you hear that?
Honestly, no, I can't.
Okay, excellent. Well, then I will try to ignore it if you can't hear it. Anyway, so if we look at this information, oh my God, I got to mute myself for a minute.
We'll get it. And then, Roger, are you not seeing the presentation, you mean? Well, make sure you pin that screen.
Yeah, I think everyone else can see it. So
yes.
Regina, Dr. Wilson has two. He's in the meeting twice, so I think that's why we're getting the echo.
Oh, I see. Let me check that out.
Testing, testing.
I'm not getting an echo, but are you right?
No, I think it's good now. Are you good, Dr. Wilson?
I'm good on my end.
Okay.
It could have been when I had to restart Chrome and had to come back in. So,
okay.
All right. Well, my deepest apologies. That was totally unplanned, obviously.
That's usually how it goes.
Yeah. Anyway, so if we look at our CIA triad, really what we're talking about is these are the three tenets that create information security. And if we lose any one of them, then a system is considered to be unsecure. So we are going to look at least two of these Third one, not so much, but we'll briefly talk about it. So if we think about these three areas, you have confidentiality, right? How do we get information to and from senders and receivers so that only the senders and receivers can understand that and view it, and it's not available for anyone else? You have integrity, and that is to ensure that when the data left the sender, that it arrives at the receiver exactly as it was sent, that nothing has been changed, nothing has been modified, nothing has been deleted, that there is data integrity. And the last is availability. Availability is simply that when data is needed, it's able to be begotten at that point, right? So we hear a lot of denial of service attacks. Denial of service is really an availability piece. They're not destroying data. They're not changing data. They're not reading confidential data. A denial of service is basically creating so much traffic against a server that it slows way down and it cannot provide the services that it would normally provide. You have removed the availability tenet of the CIA triad. We're going to focus actually on the other two, confidentiality and integrity. I would say that most everyone, when the second you start talking about cryptography, immediately think of secrets. How do I keep everything secret, right? That's the confidentiality part. But by the end of today, we'll talk about how do we use cryptography to actually ensure data integrity, that the data has not been changed or modified or deleted in any way. So that's sort of the triad. Just sort of keep that in the back of your mind. That is the foundation for everything that we're doing. So let's talk a little bit. Let's first off get some, oops, there we go. Just some terminology real quick. So cryptography or cryptology, you'll hear both at times, really is the practice and the study of techniques of how you secure that communication, right? Encryption is the process of encoding information, right? It takes the original information known as like plain text, and we encrypt it into what we call our cipher text. And decryption obviously is the reverse, is how do we take a ciphertext and bring it back to the original form. So just some basic terminology. Let's look at a little bit of history. The first thing I would ask, and you don't have to answer, but just ponder for a moment, where did it all begin? Where did we first start using cryptography, right? And you know, a lot of times folks are like, well, probably back, you know, they think of World War II. We'll talk a little bit about the Enigma machine in a moment. So, you know, that was the case. You know, did we use cryptography before World War II? Well, cryptography has been used since the very beginning of when do we want to send secret messages. One of the earliest evidence of cryptography actually is back in the ancient Greeks and Spartans, long time ago, long before Intel, right? Really, it was how do we communicate? And for them, they used what was called a skytail. It's actually pretty cool. Think of having a dowel, a wooden dowel that they wrapped parchment, a strip of parchment paper around it, and then they could write their message on it and then just send the paper. And in order to encrypt it, you had to have the same size dowel. If you had a different size wooden dowel, you wouldn't be able to see the message. Now, pretty easy to figure this out, right? Didn't say these were incredibly difficult not to crack, but there was evidence of that. Probably what most folks think of when you sort of study cryptography and you look at the history is what's called a Caesar cipher. This was actually used by Julius Caesar as he was trying to communicate with his generals and military folks. And really, it's a substitution cipher. It just means like if we were to take our alphabet A through Z and now we shift it. So this is an example here. If you look at this picture, this is a shift of a -3 where we do a left shift, 3 characters. So E's become B's, A's become X's because it has to wrap around the alphabet, and everything shifts over. Now you can see there's many different keys to this, because you could have a +3, a positive meaning shift to the right 3, shift to the right 7, 11, 12, 8, 4, 26, right? There's a lot of different keys that you could use. So is this difficult to crack? Is this a very, very secure cipher? Well, here's an example. All right, this is my favorite quote. I won't tell you who the author is yet, but this is my favorite quote that I have on my office door. And there are times in which I'll give this to a class in this encrypted, and they're able to crack it pretty easily. What do you know about the English alphabet? Right? The English alphabet, there are certain letters that are used far more frequently than others, right? So when I look at this quote, the first thing I see if I were trying to crack this is there is a single word X. Okay, X has to translate, in this case, probably to either an A or an I, right? If it's a substitution cipher, that means if the original text, if a word had 7 letters, then in the encrypted, it has 7 letters, right? So I could start looking at that. What's one of the most common letters of the English alphabet? The letter E is very, very common. If you watch Wheel of Fortune, right, you always get certain letters there. So I start looking at these and I say, well, do I see a letter that's occurring a lot? Well, I'm seeing a lot of B's, right? And so we can start to put some letters in and begin to come up with this. And actually, this is the negative by a vowel. Nicely done. This is the 3-letter cipher that I just showed you. So if we were to then shift to the right 3, we could decrypt this, and it's actually a quote from the late Robin Williams. Everyone you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about. Be kind always. And that was the phrase that you just saw that was encrypted using a Caesar cipher. Let's jump way ahead from Caesar all the way to World War II. Now, there's a lot that went on there in world history, but we have an hour. So we're going to jump up and look at the German Enigma Machine. Now, the German Enigma Machine was used for encrypting communications within the German army via ships, ground troops, the whole 9 yards. So what this was a device that had, and as you can see here, I've given you how many different settings this had. Every day, the German army would have a little book that told it what setting had to be done. So there was plugs and levers and rotors, and they all had to be set for that day's communications. If the Allies were trying to crack this machine with no help whatsoever, in order to crack it, you would have to check over 1,840 billion settings every second in order to crack it in a 24-hour period. It's incredibly complex. And if you did crack it, the next day is a new setting and you start over again. And so one of the things about the German Enigma machine, there's a gentleman by the name of Alan Turing, who's really sort of considered one of the fathers, if you will, of computer science and computing. And there's actually a movie based upon his life called The Imitation Game. It is out on Netflix. It's required watching. It is an amazing story of this young man. And this is actually a picture of the machine that he built during World War II and was actually able to crack the Enigma machine, which meant that every day they were able to crack it so that they were able to decrypt messages being sent by the German army. And he's actually credited for, I believe, stopping the war within, they said that he probably shortened the war by at least 2 years, if not more, and has saved hundreds of thousands of lives because of that. And again, it was a matter of how do you do this? Well, if you go back to what we just mentioned, how in the world do you figure out and check almost 2,000 billion settings every second? They didn't have the computing power back then to do that. They needed help. And just like any good social engineering, they also were able to sort of social engineer this. The one mistake that the German army made every single day is they started every day with a weather report and ended it with the phrase Heil Hitler. Knowing that that was the phrase, they didn't have to check 2,000 billion settings. They were able to reduce that scope of what they had to check, and they were able to be able to crack it. It's pretty amazing. It's a great story, and it deals with cryptography throughout the whole thing. So definitely go check that out. So everything we've talked about up to this point really is cryptography for confidentiality, right? In military, very, very important. In just everyday business at this point, very important, right? Trade secrets, all sorts of information. Well, there's a couple different types of cryptography. One is called private key cryptography, or symmetric, all right? It's basically a single key. So I have a key that I hold. We exchange keys somehow. We have to talk about that. And so I encrypt using a key, and then you're able to decrypt using a key. And so in here, just so you understand my notation, K is for key, and the sub S is for secret, M is the message. So if I'm able to take a message, Alice applies a secret key to it, that creates ciphertext, and then Bob's able to decrypt using the same key, where I can apply those keys. This is called symmetric. The issue here is how does Alice and Bob agree on a key? How do they get those keys? And key management means I would have to have a different key for every single person I ever talk to or I communicate with. So key management becomes a nightmare in this type of cryptography. But it's easy. It's very easy from the actual cryptography aspect. The difficult side of it is the management of that, okay? So how do you do that? Definitely need to reconsider. So the other type of cryptography is what's called public key or asymmetric. Now this is very common, and essentially every person has a public and a private key. And so when you do encryption, we hand out our public key, and folks can, and it's totally public. So I don't have to worry about keeping that secret. I can give it to everyone. Anyone that wants to communicate with me uses my public key to do the encryption, and then I use the secret key for decryption, and the secret key is never handed out. That way, we don't have to agree on keys. If you want to communicate to me, I simply send you my public key. I don't have to worry about keeping it secret because it's public. There's no secret there. If I want to communicate with you, you would send me your public key. So if we had a communication, everything I send you, I would use your public key to encrypt it. Everything you send me, you would use my public key. And then each of us would use our own private keys to do the decryption. So how does this work? Well, there's a very famous algorithm out there. Well, actually, we'll get to it in a second. We're about to go into Rsa Cryptography. But for the public key algorithms like RSA, there's two things that have to happen. First off, the public key and the private key have to be, think of them as inverses of each other. Whatever one of them does, the other one undoes, right? Sort of do and undo. So it's almost like easy mathematics. Think of square and square root as an example, right? If I take the number 3 and I square it and get 9, then I do the square root and I come back and I get 3. They have to be able to be inverses of each other. And the other thing that's very important is if you're given a public key, it should be impossible to compute the private key. That's why you could hand the public key out everywhere. And so how does that happen? Well, in order to make something impossible to compute, we're going to have to use prime numbers, and we're going to have to use really big numbers. Once you get to extremely large numbers, it's very, very difficult to go through and factor those to be able to reverse the process. And so this computational complexity is what the entire cryptography and encryption and decryption is based off. It's based off of this this difficulty, this complexity. So let's take a look at what's called one of the standards. It's called the Rsa Algorithm. It was named after these three folks here. And let's, before we dive into that, let's get just a little mathy. Need to understand modular arithmetic. Now, I think most folks do, but just as a quick review, we almost have to go back to 4th grade for just a moment. Back when you learned long division, and before you knew fractions, your teacher always told you, go ahead and write the answer, like, what is 11 divided by 4? You do the long division, 2. 2 times 4 is 8. I do the subtraction, I get 3. I don't know what to do with the 3, so you wrote the big R, right? We wrote R3. Little did you know they were preparing you to be crypto analysts at the time. But the big R is the modular arithmetic we're talking about. So if we talk about 11 mod 4, what we're really saying is, what is the remainder after you take 11 divided by 4? So in this case, 11 mod 4 would be 3. Modular arithmetic is very important. And hopefully, just in this example, if there are many problems where you would get an answer of 3, right? So if you think of 11 mod 4, right? 7 mod 3, I'm sorry, that would be 4. 7 mod 4 is also 3. So here's an example where if you know the answer is 3, you can't calculate what the problem was. You can't reverse engineer it because there are many, many problems that give you that same answer. That's why it's impossible to reverse. So let's have some fun and play with this. So I'm going to very quickly, this is super high level, but then we'll actually do it and it'll make a little more sense. This is the actual RSA algorithm. You start by choosing two very, very large prime numbers, upwards of 1,024-bit numbers. These are huge. For our example, we're going to choose like 5 and 7. We're going to choose really, really small numbers so we can do it. Once you've chosen two prime numbers, you multiply them together. It gives you what's called n. You subtract one less from each of them and multiply them, gives you z. Then there's a process to come up with another number called e, which has to be relatively prime. I know right now everybody's like, okay, I don't even know where you're going. This is the algorithm. We'll do it. And in the end, once you work through this process, the n and the e, that is your public key that you hand out. But the n and the d, those two things you keep private. So what I want to do is let's actually do an example of this, and we won't get super mathy here. Well, in fact, when we start using larger numbers, I have a program that I wrote that will help us do this. So let's actually do one. Let's pretend that Bob, oh, actually I need to give you the algorithm. I just told you how to come up with those letters. The algorithm is this. M represents the message. So to create a ciphertext, all you do is take your message, raise it to the power of E, and do modular arithmetic. To decipher, to decrypt, you take the ciphertext and raise it. All right. The plus and minus back on the on my notation, public, private. So when I have K plus, this would be, say, Bob's public key. And when I have the K minus, this would be Bob's private key. So when you see notation coming up shortly, and I use that, just understand there the plus or minus means public and private. K means key, and then the letter B stands for whose key it is in this case, if we were talking about Bob. Okay. So let's go ahead and let's go through an example. So let's say Bob chooses 5 and 7. Okay. He multiplies them together, gets 35. Subtract 1 from each, multiplies it together, he gets 24. So he's got a Z. He needs to choose E. He's got to pick a number for E that is relatively prime to Z. Relatively prime simply means they share no common factors other than 1. Doesn't mean that they're both prime numbers. They just don't have anything in common other than 1. So he chose 5 because 5 and 24, the only thing in common is the factor 1. And then he calculates D, and we won't worry about that. We'll use a program to help us with that one real quick. And so let's say Bob now hands Alice, he hands her his public key. And D is actually the last piece of data, which there E times D minus 1 has to be divisible by Z. And it sounds really weird, but we'll use a program to help us determine that. D, let's just think D is the last piece of data once you have the rest. So let's encrypt something. Let's take the number 12. Let's encrypt it using the public key. So we would take 12 raised to the 5th power. That gives us the 24,832. And now we do that mod n, which is 35, and we get the number 17. Okay, that seems somewhat reasonable. Maybe don't totally understand the various steps, but there's the algorithm. We send 17 to whoever we're sending it to. Now they need to decrypt it using the private key. So they take that 17, they raise it to D, which is 29, and look at the number they get. Pretty large. They now take that number and do modular arithmetic with 35, and magically they get 12. Now you can't figure out what that private key is because modular arithmetic is not reversible. So all of a sudden, here's that huge number. There's no way that you're going to be able to figure out which number that was in order to be able to do this, because it's not reversible. This was really simple with really, really small primes, right? Single digit. Let's go through and do one ourselves. Let's demo one. Let's pretend we're going to communicate. So the first thing we have to do is we have to come up with our private and public keys, right? So to do that, let's go through and let's choose some bigger numbers, okay? The private key is you have to calculate it. This is the process. That one slide that had 6 steps, this is where we get a little mathy, but that is a process of determining what your private key is and what your public key is. Everything comes from the first 2 numbers that you choose, which is P and Q. You just pick 2 primes, right? So we're going to pick 2 primes, 131 and 271. Now, using the algorithm I said a moment ago, I'm just going to tell you this is our N, 35,501. Here's our Z, 35,100. I had to choose a number that actually was relatively prime with that 35,100. So I just chose 3,337. Those are relatively prime, are also called co-primes if you study mathematics. And then I use my program to go through and determine what the D is, because the D can be many, many numbers. And so I get all those values. Now, once I have those values, if someone wants to communicate to me, I give them the 35,501 and the 3337. So here's my private key, or public, sorry, this is my public key. Use this to communicate to me. And then whatever you send me, I can use my private key. So let's say someone wants to communicate with us. And so we hand them our public key, 35,501 and 3,337, and say, here you go. Here's the algorithm. Take your message, whatever it is, plug it into this formula, and you're going to get your ciphertext, and that's what you send to me. So Alice wants to send us, let's say, wants to send us the number 65. Well, she's got to encrypt it. So she's going to take 65, according to the algorithm. She's going to raise it to the 3,337th power and do a mod of 35,501. Seems relatively easy to do. She does that, and lo and behold, she gets, for the ciphertext, 24,087. Okay, done. Now, you might look at that and go, well, that's pretty easy. Anybody know what the number 65 raised to the 3,337 even looks like? It looks like this. That is that number. All right? You can easily see how this is very difficult to crack, virtually impossible. All right? Because you have to be able to factor this number in order to be able to crack RSA. So you have to be able to come up there. Factor that. All right, so we get the number 24,087. Awesome. So now we're going to decrypt it. So we take 24,087, that's the ciphertext. We now have to raise that to the power 57,073. And whatever that number is, we do our mod, and we're going to get our message. What should we get? Remember, Alice is trying to send us the number 65, right? Well, we can go ahead and do this. Now, I thought you would be interested, before we go any further, what is the number 24,087 raised to 57,000, etc.? Let me do a quick share. I think I have to stop presenting, and then, yep, I have to change back and forth. So I'm going to show you. Here is, as soon as it comes up, here is this number. Well, actually, it's only page 1 of this number. Ladies and gentlemen, this is 82 pages long. Okay? This is why cryptography is incredibly complex, mathematically complex, right? 82 pages long. And remember, we only chose numbers like, what did we choose? 131 and 271. Those are still so small numbers. Can you imagine if we started choosing numbers that were literally, hundreds of digits long, and then you get to this? You wouldn't have 82 pages. You would have thousands of pages of a single number that would have to be factored, right? So I like folks to see the complexity of that. It is so complex, and that's where the power comes in cryptography. So going back to the presentation. Takes a second to swap here, I guess. So in the end, if we go through and actually do this, oh, you know what? At the Tech Academy, you guys do a course in Python, correct? You can nod.
We do.
Excellent. All right, so I'm going to, sorry for the screen thrashing. Let me go to Python real quick. So the nice thing about Python is at the interpreter level, Python is amazing with extremely large numbers. For example, if I wanted to do the 65 raised to the 3,337 like I did a moment ago, don't do that for you. And I can scroll up. So there's the start of that number all the way down. So Python is very, very quick. So because it uses some things that are way beyond the scope of this course on how it deals with large numbers. But you can sit here and use Python to do some of this cryptanalysis. So things like what I just mentioned a moment ago is 24,087. Oops, I'm not on that screen. 24,087 raised to the 57,073 takes it a sec, but it is able to give you that number. Remember, we're still dealing with small numbers, believe it or not. So that means if I did this RSA algorithm, 24,087 raised to the 57,073 mod, remember we did the mod and then 35,501. This is the decryption algorithm. If we've done it correctly, when I hit enter, 65. And so all of a sudden we were able to decrypt that number, that encryption and decryption. So Python is cool. And if you're interested, one of the things that I will do, and I need, oh, I'm already in demos. here is a really simple little Python script that goes through and helps you come up with all of those numbers for N and Z's and E's, etc. And I'll be glad to supply the source code. So as part of that, if folks want to play with this, you're more than welcome to do that. But Python is an amazing language for very quick, down and dirty computing. All right, let's continue on here. We want to get through this, and we can have some other discussions. Let's get out of the mathy part of this. All right. So we did the computation. We got 65. That's great. So everything we've talked about up to this point in this first 45 minutes had to do with confidentiality, which is so important, right? What about integrity? What about data integrity? How can I use cryptography to prove that the data has not changed, right? And right now, if you think about it, in order to encrypt for confidentiality, I encrypt using a public key, and then you decrypt using a private key. What if we flipped that? What if instead I now encrypt using my private key and I send it to you? You can decrypt it using my public key. Anybody could decrypt it using my public key. So there's no confidentiality there. But what does it do? It proves that I was the one that wrote that message because you were able to decrypt it. So I'm able to actually prove that I'm the author of that. We call these things digital signatures. A lot of folks think a digital signature is writing on paper with a pen, scanning it, and dropping that image onto a document. A true digital signature is a cryptography method for, quote, signing a document that proves that you were the author. So in this case, Bob's message, whatever it may be, if he uses his private key, remember the minus means private, B means Bob, so this says Bob's private key in the middle, and then when it gets over to Alice, she's able to, or that is the message that he's going to send, and then Alice is able to decrypt it using his public key. All right. So suppose Alice receives a message with the signature, Bob's private key. Alice verifies that Bob signed it by applying his public key. She's able to get the message. Now, whoever signed it must have used Bob's private key. So she knows that, number one, Bob signed it and no one else signed it. This gives you non-repudiation. This is provable in a court of law that, again, no one signed it but Bob. That's the digital signature. Now, it doesn't give you confidentiality. It gives you integrity, which is one of those options. Okay. Saw that K minus, so that isn't the private key. Yeah. So K plus is the public, K minus is the private. And I apologize if I flipped them, chalk it up to old age. So here's the question though. If you're really going to prove that I sent you a message, in order to do that, I need to send you the message and I need to send you the signed copy of the message. That way you can decrypt, and if the messages are the same, it proves that I'm the author. Well, if all of a sudden the messages get really, really, really large, I'm now having to send you twice as much every single message. I have to send you the whole message, and I have to send you. All right. Yeah, I did see that. So here's the deal. There's nothing here on Alice, and I should have said that. This is Bob, his message. He's encrypting it, and so the thing on the right is the encrypted message that he's going to send to Alice by using his private key. So thank you. I appreciate that. I didn't explain that well and allowed me to go back and clean that up. So if the messages are really, really large, that means that we're doubling the amount of network traffic. We're doubling the amount of information we're having to send, because we're having to send the message so that you can read it, and we're going to have to send a digitally signed message that proves that we wrote it. So how do we deal with that? And this is where they come up with what are called message digests. So we hash the message. And basically, again, it's very, very computationally expensive to encrypt really long messages. So what if we created a shorter hash of that? So let's think of this as throwing it into a hash function. It creates a digital fingerprint. And then instead of signing the message, sign the message digest. Now I can send both of these. Now this is a really complex screen, and I apologize for that. But essentially, if you think of what's going to happen, let's take just the left half. Bob has a really large message he needs to send. So he's going to put that together, right? He's going to send that along with, he's going to hash it, which gives him a digital, digest of it. He's going to sign it, which gives him digitally signature on the digest. He puts those two things together and sends it off to Alice. When Alice receives it, which is on the right half of the screen, she gets it out of the mail. She has the large message because that's part of it, but she doesn't know if that's really the message or not. Doesn't know whether anything has changed, but she does have a signed, digitally signed digest. Well, then what she's going to do is she'll hash it, and she will decrypt the digest and then compare them. If they're the same, she knows that she got the original message. So it's a little complex that way, but the way to think of it is this. For confidentiality, I'm going to encrypt with your public, and you decrypt with your private. If I want to prove that I was the author, then I encrypt with my private and you decrypt with my public. The difference between a digital digest and the signature is the digest is simply the hash, something of a hash function. It's the hash of the message. It's not digitally signed yet. Then when you apply a digital signature to the message digest, then you get the signed digital digest. So there's two pieces to that. There's both the message digest and then the digital signature applied to that. I know this gets complex, and I apologize for that, but trying to keep, believe it or not, I'm trying to keep it as high level as possible. So we've talked about confidentiality. We've talked about integrity. What if you want both? I need it to be confidential, but I need to prove that I'm the one that sent it to you. Then you have to take these two processes and you have to combine them. I'm not going to go over it, but I'll show it to you. This is merely going from Alice to send it. This picture shows that We're taking the message, we're going to hash it, we're going to sign the hash. We put that together with the message, then we we encrypt it using a key. And what happens here is Alice actually ends up using 3 keys. Uses her private key because she's signing things. She uses Bob's public key because she's encrypting for confidentiality. And she's going to create a new symmetric key. So that's how we get keys from one to another. At the beginning, I talked about key management was horrific. The way you do it is you use asymmetric cryptography in order to move a symmetric key from one to another. Super high level. I realize it got really techy, really mathy, really fast. It's really tough not to. But it sort of gives you a high level of understanding as to it all, ladies and gentlemen, it all goes back to this. When we think of information security, there are 3 areas. Availability has nothing to do with cryptography. It simply has to do with whether the information is available or not. Confidentiality must use cryptography, and we encrypt with our public, decrypt with private. Integrity is proving or signing the data. We encrypt with private and decrypt with public. So the encryption methods for confidentiality and integrity are exactly opposite. And so you have to combine both methods if you're trying to send something that is both confidential and must be digitally signed. So there was a lot there. I'm going to open it up at this point. Questions, comments, thoughts. I always go too deep, and especially, I mean, if you're not familiar with this, I apologize for the super mathy stuff, but hey, you got to see an 82-page number.
No, that was great, Dr. Brent. Yeah, leave your questions in the chat, or if anybody has a question, you can raise your hand, you can unmute your mic. But I think you pretty much answered the questions as you were going through the presentation. So if there's any questions that were missed, let me know, remind me of those so we can ask those questions.
And Regina, would you probably ping me as a reminder, and I will send you the slide deck and the Python code.
Yes, of course.
Yeah, we'll make sure that's available.
Robert, it's a great question. Online references, etc., for this subject. It's as you can tell just in this, it is really hard to talk about this at a beginning level and keep it at a level that is understandable without diving really deep, really fast. And so in your searches, I would definitely be looking for things on, you know, sort of beginning encryption, decryption, that type of thing, because it goes really fast. I know I didn't give you any resources off the top of my head. I don't know where I would go with this for some introductory type references. If I come up with some, I will pass them along. So the private key is to encrypt and the public key is to decrypt in integrity. That is correct. And it's just the opposite of that for confidentiality. All right.
Then there were some questions that I think Sherry had.
Larry. I'll just leave the PNP for now.
All right, so Rick, did you have something to say?
No, go ahead with the question. I'll have a question after.
Okay. So how were you able to quickly determine how many pages of encrypted numbers you got?
So I used Python, old school. I literally copied the number and pasted it into Word. And then
There goes the number of the pages.
yeah, that was the quickest way to do it for me, because otherwise it's just text, right? And we all know there's no page breaks or anything like that.
Got it. And then what is the difference between information security and cryptography?
That is excellent. Information security is, think of that as the umbrella that covers everything. And in this slide, it covers confidentiality, it covers integrity, it covers availability. It is the sum total of securing information, whereas cryptography is one small piece that is used to achieve confidentiality, or it's a method used to achieve integrity. If you're part of the school and you've been working through the programs, a great example would be, I have this set of data and I give it to you, and you can choose any language you want and program for me. I need the data back out sorted. Okay, so the big picture is I need sorted data, but the methodology, did you choose a bubble sort? Did you choose quick sort? Did you choose selection sort? Did you choose, right? Each of those are different methodologies, different algorithms to achieve the goal of a sorted data set. Here, information security is the ultimate goal, and cryptography is one of the methods or the algorithms to achieve that.
And then one last question from Sherry. Will you define what Intel is? Is it a thing, or does it refer to people? I think they were referring to when in the beginning of the presentation you were talking about Intel, a device.
Oh, yeah, sorry, you're right, because that word has different meanings. I was actually talking about the corporation, because we were talking about when did cryptography begin, and when I was talking about, we were World War II or before then, and I said there was no Intel. Totally get it. I meant Intel Corp. Yeah, right. A lot of times when I ask, when did we start using cryptography, people literally a lot of times will say, like 1980s, because that's when the computer, the PCs came out, right? And they think of cryptography as something that is digital and something that is computer related, and it's not the case. Cryptography is the science and methods of securing information for confidentiality typically. And that goes clear back to the beginning of time. Great. Those are great questions, by the way.
Yeah.
Looks like Ransom has raised his hand. I'm going to unmute his mic, and then you can go ahead with your question, Ransom. All right, go ahead, Ransom. What's your question?
Hey there. Hey, Dr. Wilson. Sorry, I only came through part way, so I apologize if this was addressed.
No worries.
But for the private key and the public key, are those being used to convert the data that is being sent itself to into that encryption, and then because the reason I'm asking is, I guess, will the person know that you've received it because it comes back in like a readable format, basically, or is it a separate keys and that isn't actually related to the data content?
The keys themselves are in this case, using RSA, are the numeric values that you need to use to encrypt something to be sent. And the information being sent, we'll call it ciphertext. It's the encrypted data that's moving from sender to receiver, and then the receiver obviously uses the other keys, in this case private key, to decrypt that. So it's not so much that the data never travels in a readable format, right? That's the ultimate goal here for confidentiality. Because if I were to execute a man-in-the-middle attack and we're able to read the communications, I want them to be completely unreadable, right? Because I don't have the keys to do the decryption. And I'm not sure I answered your question, but that's...
Yeah, no, that definitely gets it partially. I was thinking mostly for the integrity aspect, like if you're just confirming that it's sent, does that data isn't necessarily, you said it wasn't really, the data itself wasn't encrypted, so it's not secure, but you're sending it. So what does the receiver of the information, how do they know if they've decrypted the private key correctly?
Excellent question. And that is because if we're doing just integrity, I would send you the message, clear text, so you could read it, and the signed copy.
Oh, okay, got it.
And that way, when you decrypt the signed copy, you do a comparison, right? You do a diff.
Yeah,
and if those
it should match. Yeah.
Right, and they should match. Right. So it's rare to be using cryptography only for integrity, right? Mm-hmm. We think of we try to encrypt everything, but it is definitely important as the two tenets of confidentiality and integrity coupled together is very important, because if you're doing just integrity, okay, I can execute a man-in-the-middle attack and you won't know it.
Yeah.
And so it is important that the two things come together. So anyway, yeah. And I could do a man-in-the-middle attack on confidentiality as well. So it is, that's why in actual practice, this was all theory, but in actual practice, we have certificate authorities like thwart, things like that allow you, so you're able to verify certificates, right? All of us probably at some point have gone to some website that pops up and says, hey, this certificate is invalid. Do you want to continue? This could be dangerous, right? And that's because those security certificates were not being validated through some sort of a certificate authority, but they're maybe self-signed. So, okay. Thwart.
Thank you so much.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Just said thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah, you're welcome. Sherry, I'll define man-in-the-middle real quick. Simply this. Let's say there's three of us. Bob and Alice want to talk to each other, and Bob sends a message to Alice saying, hey, give me your public key. I need to encrypt some stuff. I jump in the middle and I grab it and I send him back my public key and go, hi, I'm Alice. He encrypts using my key, sends it to me. I decrypt it and I send it off to Alice going, hey, I'm Bob. And so now all the communication is going through me and I'm decrypting it and encrypting it back in the middle. And Bob and Alice have no idea that that's the case. They could still meet each other tomorrow at the water cooler in the office and they could talk about the conversation they had, and they would never ever know that someone was in the middle of that. So that's why all of the actual applications of this, when there's corporate solutions like these companies, Thwart is a company, there's a number of them that actually do certificate certificate authentications. I hope that helped a little bit.
Great. Rick, did you have a question?
Yeah, just a quick one. Dr. Wilson, when you are, say you're using like huge prime numbers for the algorithm, so say it's like for government or military, that kind of thing, is there computational lag time with encrypting and decrypting?
Oh, absolutely. And so that is why, and on the very last, one of the last slides that I had that was really complex, but that is why public and private key encryption is not used for the entire conversation. It's used to establish a communication link that's encrypted, and then we will share through public and private key a symmetric key, and then the remainder of the computation will be, we will just use that symmetric key. So you start with public encryption long enough to exchange a secret key, and now we'll use that key moving forward for that particular communication. That way I can choose some sort of a random key. I don't have to keep I don't have to manage keys on a per conversation basis. There's no question, it is very computationally intensive.
Got it.
Looks like we just got one last question. I know we're kind of going over the 2 o'clock mark, but for the cases of both confidentiality and integrity, which keys do you use for what? Meaning
Right.
private or public?
So probably the easiest one to remember is the confidentiality, because that's when people think cryptography, what's the first thing you think of? Keeping something private, right? I mean, everybody thinks that. And so because of that, the easiest way to think of it is a public key is one that I hand out. Anybody can use it. And that's how you communicate with me. You have to encrypt something using that. And then I use my private key to decrypt it. And I don't hand out my private key. That's just for me. In integrity, that flips. In integrity, if I want to send you something, I will encrypt it using my private key, and you're able to decrypt using my public, and it proves, that signs the document, that proves that I'm the one that authored it. So if you can remember the confidentiality one, then just remember it's flipped for integrity. All right. I'll grab that last one. Is this all there is about cryptography? Cryptology. No, this is barely scratching the surface, because you got to dive into what are the various cryptographic algorithms that are out there, and the types of cryptography and things like that. This was meant to just literally dip your toe, even though you might have felt like you were underwater.
Yeah, I'm sure it's a lot more complicated, but thank you so much. That was a great presentation, as always. Also, if you guys don't know, we're recording this session, and then we're going to be posting it to our YouTube channel later, so you can watch it later today. Here's a link to our Tech Talk playlist.
Let me grab Sherry's last question real quick. Thwart is a company, and they manage certificates, right? So think of like web certificates and things like that. That's digitally signed. They prove that I am who I say I am. And there's many companies out there that do that. And the last one was, since they're opposites and you want both at the same time, what about what you need for both? It's integrating both processes, so you're creating a digest while at the same time encrypting for confidentiality. It's both of those processes put together, and that's what gets sent. And then on the other side, the receiver literally does the reverse, right? It unpackages those, proves that you are who you say you are, and then at the same time is able to decrypt the message. All right, very good.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Brent. And then also, I'm going to share next week's Tech Talk with you guys. It's about how to be a successful software developer. So it's going to definitely be a great talk. So join us next week. And then also, we're going to have another in-person event. It's going to be in 2 weeks. Here's the listing on Meetup if you want to check it out and you want to join us. So thank you again, Doctor. Thanks for always giving us an awesome presentation. And thank you, everyone, for joining today's talk. And I hope to see you guys next week.
No problem. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah,
Take
thanks,
care.
Dr. Wilson. Great presentation. And yeah, I'll be watching this again over the weekend.
Yeah,
So,
no worries. Stay safe, everyone.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
All righty.
Thanks
Bye-bye.
all. Have a good weekend.